without further ado, I would like to introduce the president of Montgomery College, who has offered to introduce our speaker tonight. And she is none other than Dr. Darianne Pollard. Thank you so much.
I'd like to start off by thanking Professor Joan Naik for the outstanding work she does with the Symposia. It is amazing to me that we spend so much time in higher education talking about many different issues, but we oftentimes don't feed our intellectual curiosity about these issues. So I thank Joan for taking this idea, giving it birth, giving it wings, and spending time to recruit and bring such phenomenal talent and human beings to speak with our college community and to really bring, I think, perspectives that we hunger for. So thank you, Joan, for that work that you do each and every day in that regard. I should start off also by saying good evening, and I hope that each of you is prepared for what will be, I think, an outstanding lecture this evening discussion. We're here tonight to discuss using our human rights to advance our common humanity. Common humanity is such a phrase that I love, and it really reminds me of a quote that I love from Dr. King. Professor Smith mentioned him earlier, and I use this a lot, a quote from his letter from a Birmingham jail where he says, quote, "We are caught in an inescapable network of mutuality, tied in a single garment of destiny. Whatever affects one directly affects us all indirectly." Such a powerful idea that we are deeply connected to each other, even if we know that in that time and space. The quality of our own lives can only be best understood and measured by the quality of life of all the members in the community that we live in, the world in which we are a part of. Advancing our common humanity means that every member of our society has access to fundamental rights, including the right to an education, regardless of race, ethnicity, sexual orientation, gender, socioeconomic status, and any other difference. That also reminds me another quote that I love of Dr. Cornel West when he talks about that social justice is really love made public. The idea that if you love someone, you don't want to see them hungry, you don't want to see them homeless, you don't want to see their rights violated. Indeed, each of us should be fighting for a world in which humanity and social justice is not just something that we say some other folks do, but something that we do each and every day with the communities that we live in. 2014 marks the 50th anniversary of the landmark legislation, the Civil Rights Act of 1964, that outlawed discrimination on the basis of race, color, religion, sex, or national origin. It sought to protect victims of discrimination and racism, who's, like Henrietta Lacks, the subject of One Book Germantown, whose cells doctors removed from medical research without her permission or even knowledge. Talk about basic human rights, your body, and other people using your body in ways that you did not give permission for them to do so. If any singular individual experiences a deprivation of human rights, we as a society suffer as a whole. The speaker here today is an expert on these very types of issues. A professor at law at Howard University School of Law, director of the Constitutional Law Center, associate dean of academic affairs, Lisa Crooms is an expert on constitutional law, gender and the law, international human rights law, and Supreme Court jurisprudence. She's a Fulbright scholar, having researched the relationship between gender, violence, and the law, and in the construction of a Jamaican post-independence national identity. One of her most significant articles is entitled "The Future of the United States Commission on Civil Rights," in which she argues for the expansion of the commission to include human rights. Professor Crooms also participated in a distinguished panel testifying before the Congressional Black Caucus on Race in America. She has been a human rights activist for 3 decades, working with the Washington Office on Africa and the American Committee on Africa. She is currently a board member for the National Economic and Social Rights Initiative, the U.S. Human Rights Network, and the Women's Institute for Leadership Development for Human Rights. Professor Crooms has helped orchestrate U.S. coordinated non-governmental organization shadow reports to the United Nations Committee on Elimination of All Forms of Racial Discrimination, as well as on the U.S. compliance with the National Covenant on Civil and Political Rights. She has been an advisor to a number of prestigious human rights institutions and has participated in a number of international consultations. She is also, besides being an activist, an intellectual, and her work is something that each of us should aspire to spend time reviewing. Professor Crooms received her bachelor's degree in economics from Howard University and her JD from the University of Michigan. We are in store what I believe will be an intellectual treat, that we are going to contemplate the mutuality of our experiences and the common humanity. It is my pleasure to welcome you this evening and to introduce our speaker to the stage, Professor Lisa Crooms. Please join me in welcoming her.
Good evening.
Good evening.
I don't know that I can live up to all of this. Thank you, thank you, thank you, thank you, thank all of you for coming. And thanks for the invitation. I have to say that this is my second year as an administrator, and I have to say I prefer this to having to figure out when classes are supposed to be scheduled. So thank you for this opportunity. You see that in between the time that I identified what my speech was going to be about and the time I got here, it's not that it changed, it refined. And this is all about using human rights to advance our common humanity, but the specific topics I plan to cover tonight are up there, and they're linked by the notion of the importance of indivisibility. Henrietta Lacks, Paulie Murray, and Moral Mondays. To be indivisible means you are unable to be divided or separated. This is the dictionary definition. In the US, most of us are most familiar with indivisibility in the context of the Pledge of Allegiance. One nation, indivisible, with liberty and justice for all. This is what most of us can identify as perhaps our first exposure to the concept of indivisibility. But I dare say most of us recite those words reflexively, without much regard for what the words mean. Indeed, from September 1968 through June 1973, I started each school day with the Pledge of Allegiance. I doubt that many of us at Edgar Elementary School in Metuchen, New Jersey, really took seriously the pledge we recited as regularly as our hygiene was inspected and our homework was checked. And I know I've dated myself at this point, because I doubt very seriously that you still get your hygiene checked in elementary school. But Mrs. Hicks and Mrs. Smith would come by. You had to have a tissue. Your nails had to be clean. They checked to see that your teeth were fine, and they checked your hair every day. I am a child of the 60s and 70s. I always assumed that the indivisible nation to which we pledged our allegiance was the nation framed by the Constitution in 1787. Not until I was an adult did I learn that the pledge was first penned in 1892, almost 30 years after the Civil War ended, and the divided nation began the business of reconstruction and reunification. The pledge reaffirmed the indivisible nation the Constitutional Convention formed based on a compromise that not only rendered most blacks property, but also excluded all blacks from we the people. The year the pledge was written, Homer Plessy first tested the constitutionality of Louisiana's law requiring separate train cars for blacks and whites. It would take 4 years for the US Supreme Court to declare separate but equal to be consistent with the constitutional requirements of equality and due process. Not until 1954 would the same court correct its mistake and acknowledge the illogic of Plessy's holding. The legal victory realized in Brown versus Board of Education was part of intensified domestic and international advocacy designed to hold the United States to account for having failed to keep the Reconstruction Amendment's promises of personhood and citizenship for African Americans. The same year I entered first grade, both Dr. King and Bobby Kennedy were assassinated. Shirley Chisholm was elected to Congress. Massive protests at the Democratic National Convention were met with police violence, and Tommie Smith and John Carlos raised their fists during the 200-meter medal ceremony at the Summer Olympics in Mexico City. America's status quo was under assault, and Metuchen, New Jersey was somewhere between the nation to which I pledged my allegiance on the one hand, and the culture of the black and conscious on the other. Over time, this assault created a context in which the pledge's commitment to liberty and justice for all seemed to ring hollow, even in my elementary school years. What I want to talk to you about this evening has to do with, as I noted, the importance of indivisibility. I am using as my starting point a book with which you are all quite familiar. I won't ask for hands, because I assume everyone has at least glanced at it, or are you required to read it? That's not a rhetorical question. Some were required to read it. So some of you all in here have read this. Those of you all who haven't, I'm telling you, it's a fascinating read. So I am using as my starting point this book. My remarks this evening will, in a brief period, link Henrietta Lacks, Paulie Murray, to whom I will introduce some of you who might not know who she is, and the Moral Mondays movement. In the context of my remarks this evening, Henrietta Lacks represents the injury wrought by the extreme disaggregation, taking, cultivating, and using her immortal cells involves. This was essentially a dividing of her cells as a representation of her body from her soul, which represented in some ways her humanity. Paulie Murray offers indivisibility that is expressed in the instruments and discourses of human rights law as it relates both to the individuals involved and the rights they hold. Moral Mondays stand, in my opinion, as the current example of Paulie Murray's indivisibility in practice, designed and intentionally deployed to overcome and remedy the injuries, such as those sustained by Henrietta Lacks, as well as those that continue to be sustained by her descendants. So I'll take them one at a time. We will start, quite fittingly, with Henrietta Lacks. Most of you all perhaps have seen the black and white picture, and for those of you all who aren't science people, those are called HeLa cells. Those are Henrietta's immortal cells. I believe this is mitosis, someone explained to me. I was an econ major, I didn't really do hard science. I vaguely remember mitosis, and I believe that's the separating of cells. In the opening pages of her book, The Immortal Life of Henrietta Lacks, Rebecca Skloot makes the following point. The history of Henrietta Lacks and HeLa cells raises important issues regarding science, ethics, race, and class. How could it not? Ms. Lacks' story is one of a working-class black woman in Baltimore whose aggressive cervical cancer led to both a loss for her family and a breakthrough for medical research. Indeed, as Skloot observes, like guinea pigs and mice, Henrietta's cells have become the standard laboratory workhorse. HeLa cells, and it's obviously he for the first two letters of her first name, La for the first two letters of her last name. These cells represent both extreme and unethical physical alienation. On the one hand, that is in the taking and cultivating of what became her immortal cells, and the shared substance of our common humanity that requires rights be seen and experienced universally without condition or exception. On the other hand, it is a conundrum. It is oxymoronic. Only through the alienation of her cells from her body do we begin to understand that her cells represent the essential building block that binds us all together. Doctors Wharton and Gay at Johns Hopkins took Ms. Lacks's cells without her consent because, quite honestly, that kind of biopsy was consistent with standard protocol at Johns Hopkins. And Johns Hopkins is the birthplace of modern medicine and medical education. Founded in 1889, Johns Hopkins Hospital has enjoyed a tenuous at best relationship with the poor Black community in which it is located. According to Baltimore Sun reporters Kelly Brewington and David Cohn, for decades, residents of the poor neighborhood surrounding Johns Hopkins Hospital have had an uneasy relationship with the billion-dollar institution at its center. They viewed it as elitist, more interested in medical research than in their care. Although Brewington and Cohn were describing a 2008 lead abatement program, these words capture the suspicion at the center of the institution's relationship with Baltimore's Black and poor, and what is captured in the interviews and the voices of, in particular, Ms. Lacks's children and her descendants, her other descendants. Hopkins was a place where children either were and probably still are warned not to pass at night for fear of being snatched off the street and used for medical experimentation. The lore of Hopkins makes sense in a larger context in which poor Black people have been used for medical experimentation and subjected to medical procedures without their meaningful consent. That this narrative has not been roundly dismissed attests to its plausibility. That is, the reason the lore lives is because somewhere in there is a kernel of truth. Indeed, we can never forget that ours is a country with a history of slavery, the particularly American brand of which was based on the absolute dehumanization of the enslaved. The convenient use of race as a marker for those deemed human chattel meant that virtually any story that featured Blacks, particularly poor Blacks, as exploited, demonized, and despised is almost always plausible. Ms. Lacks's story is rendered even more believable, but far from something new, when we consider, for example, J. Marion Sims. You may say, who is J. Marion Sims? J. Marion Sims is identified as the father of modern gynecology. And he experimented on the enslaved women he owned on his Alabama plantation. That these stories did not end with the abolition of slavery and the amending of the US Constitution to constitutionalize what was supposed to be the transformation of property to persons and persons to citizenship, which is captured in the 13th, 14th, and 15th Amendments, is demonstrated by stories surrounding Johns Hopkins and the specific mid-20th century story of Henrietta Lacks, as well as those of the hundreds of men used as non-consenting subjects in the Tuskegee syphilis experiments, or the thousands of North Carolinians sterilized because the state deemed them unfit, or the countless other abuses committed upon unsuspecting, vulnerable, and poor Black and brown people throughout the United States. Note, however, that the US is neither the only nor the first site of such exploitation and experimentation. Indeed, Sarche Sarah Bartman, also known as the Hottentot Venus, whose buttocks and genitalia made her a sideshow attraction in Europe until her death in 1815, was used for medical observation and experimentation. Even after Sarah died, her skeleton and a cast of her body remained on exhibition until 1970, and was only taken down when activists pressured the owners of her remains to discontinue the practice. Ms. Bartman was, in fact, properly laid to rest only in 2002 in her native South Africa. The point here, however, is that the failure, or perhaps the inability, to see the humanity of Black and brown people is longstanding and widespread. While cultivating Henrietta Lacks' cancerous cervix for cells that proved to be immortal might not have been an example of that failure, choosing to commercially cultivate HeLa cells without consent from her family might very well be such an example. This is how capitalism has a tendency to, as I said earlier, use the body and ignore or discard the soul. It gets a particularly racialized reading because of the history of the US in terms of the commodification of human bodies on which this country was built and continues to stand. The injury done to Ms. Lacks and her family is the result of the complete and total disaggregation of her person. In one way, Ms. Lacks was disaggregated because her specific identity was unimportant to the immortality of her cells. Although you would never know, or will never know, really, you can wonder if we would be telling this story if the world had known the cells came from a poor Black woman. Or would the usefulness of her cells have been ignored or characterized as pathological in a way that would make sense in terms of the prevailing narrative of Black womanhood? Ironically, the racism and patriarchy that would in fact prevent her from being considered a full human being and would contribute to this narrative is the very pathology her cells could never cure. And it's interesting to note that later on, I guess quite recently, there's been some notion of HeLa cells as being tainted, that somehow they have in fact infected and somehow twisted the results of experimentation or whatever it is you do in a lab. I told you, I'm not a hard science person. And it's quite ironic because at some level, you know, they got to the demonization eventually after figuring out that most of the major breakthroughs in modern medicine since the mid-20th century come as a result of the availability of her cells to, in fact, further that research. In another way, her disaggregation and the use of her immortal cells represents, however, both the common humanity of us all in terms of the essential substance of which we are made and the lack of humanity as it relates to her because notions of permission and consent were deemed largely irrelevant to the transaction Johns Hopkins and the larger medical community made with her cells. But through this process of disaggregation and extreme and literal alienation, Ms. Lacks evinces the shared, essential, and fundamental substance of our humanity. Her immortal cells are quite literally the evidence of our common humanity, that is, our indivisibility. Now, we move from Henrietta Lacks to Paulie Murray. There's a lot you can say about Paulie Murray, but to try to reduce it to a nutshell, Paulie Murray was an activist, a poet, a lawyer, the first Black woman to be ordained an Episcopal priest. She's born in Baltimore, moves to North Carolina when her mother unexpectedly dies in childbirth, and goes on to live an extraordinary life. Paulie Murray contributes to this particular conversation in the following way. And there's a lovely picture of Paulie Murray once she's been ordained. And next to that, you'll see there's a mural project. She grew up in Durham, North Carolina. And there's a mural project in Durham that has been taken up by something called the Paulie Murray Project, which is housed in the Duke Human Rights Institute. And around Durham, there are these murals of Paulie Murray at different stages in her life, and there are quotes that accompany the mural. And it's become a very important community art project in Durham, North Carolina. Paulie Murray wrote an essay entitled The Liberation of Black Women. And in her essay, she deploys indivisibility to challenge the costs of the Pledge of Allegiance's indivisible nation. She placed in this essay Black women at the center of her analysis based on her belief that the successful outcome of the struggle against racism will depend in large part upon the simultaneous elimination of all discrimination based on sex. She was a woman far ahead of her time. She preferred using the 14th Amendment to ground women's equality and due process rights rather than seek to have added to the Constitution a separate Equal Rights Amendment. It was completely understandable that a Black woman educated by Charles Hamilton Houston at Howard University School of Law would be frustrated because the legal assault on Jim Crow would prove either unable or unwilling to demand equality between the sexes. And it's important to note here that Paulie Murray graduates first in her class. I mean, without a doubt, she's a beast, as the children say, right? The convention at that time was whoever graduated first in the class at Howard then went on to Harvard to do a master's in law. Well, at the time that she graduates, problem number one is Harvard's still all men. So her year, the year she graduated, is the only year that Howard failed to send number one in the class and chose instead to send number two in the class because she could not properly gain admission. She then said, you know, the heck with you all, and goes to Berkeley. And, you know, Berkeley didn't have the same kind of problem or the same kind of restriction. And she was able to, in fact, get her LLM at Berkeley and then went on to get what's a degree that very few people have, which is called an SJD. It's a doctorate, a true doctorate of law. She got that from Yale. And then she went to seminary when I believe she started seminary when she was about 60. She's an extraordinary woman. Okay, so where do we go? Both women and men could be parties in racial discrimination cases, but there was no requirement for intra-racial sex equality. At Howard, Murray came to embrace an expansive reading of the 14th Amendment to reach both race and sex discrimination that was rooted in a history that linked the human rights of Black women and the cost of antebellum and postbellum indivisibility of nation. This, however, did not prevent her from helping to found the National Organization for Women, which made the Equal Rights Amendment a central part of its agenda. With the ultimate failure to secure the state support needed to ratify the Equal Rights Amendment, Murray's approach proved to be the only viable option for securing women's rights as a matter of constitutional law. And one of the people who gives Murray absolute credit would be current Supreme Court Justice Ruth Bader Ginsburg. And she's gone a long way to explain that none of the work that she was able to do as the head of the women's, I think it was the project at that point, Women's Rights Project at the ACLU would have been possible without Paulie Murray bringing that intellectual heft to the table. What Paulie Murray decided was if everybody else was fighting Jim Crow, that you had to fight Jane Crow side by side. And that kind of understanding is exactly why we have any protections for discrimination on the basis of sex as a matter of equal protection of the laws using either the Fifth Amendment Due Process Clause or the 14th Amendment Equal Protection Clause. Taken to its most logical conclusion, Murray's analysis of humanity as indivisible is dynamic, capable of accounting for the myriad of ways in which oppression operates to advantage or disadvantage individuals and groups within shifting contexts. Here, there is no permanent or universal victimhood. You are able to demonstrate situations where you may in fact be oppressed, but it also requires you to step up to the plate and recognize places where you are in fact the possessor of power and capable of oppressing others. It's constantly reflexive and trying to, in fact, require people to be conscious about the position that you hold within a particular situation at that particular point in time, and understanding that a shift in context may in fact mean a shift in power dynamics, which means that you are no longer in the position that you occupied over here. We come over here, and it's a different ballgame. If humanity is viewed as indivisible, then remedying one type of oppression must avoid creating or exacerbating other types of oppression. Now, Murray's essay was written in 1970, and she makes this point by taking aim at the patriarchal prescriptions for what ailed Black women that were advanced in the interest of Black liberation. And we should also note that this is close to, I believe, the 50th year of or the 50th anniversary for the Moynihan Report. That is the, it's not the beginning, but it's probably the most popular iteration of the whole claim that slavery created a Black matriarchy, which rendered Black families and communities pathological because they, in fact, were organized in a way that was contrary to what at the time was claimed to be the way the majority was organized. Now we know, one, the whole notion of minority and majority is somewhat challenged, particularly as demographics change, but also the notion that the script or the narrative about traditional family, nuclear family, no longer holds up for the racialized majority, even in the context of what would have constituted the majority for Moynihan. But we've not necessarily made that shift. What tends to happen, it's particularly in the area of, let's say, around conversation about the social safety net, what used to be the social safety net, that concerns about, let's say, out-of-wedlock childbearing. It seems that what ends up happening is that white women end up being deemed pathological, but they're pathological for supposedly acting like Black women, engaging in Black women's behavior. And the whole notion is that you fix that by bringing a man into it, and that somehow, you know, a two-parent family is somehow supposed to fix it, without really addressing what it is that makes most single-parent households headed by women poor. And what makes most single households headed by women poor isn't the absence of a man. What makes most single-headed households headed by women poor is the fact that women cannot get jobs that pay a living wage, let alone a family wage. Montgomery County is different, you know, somewhat. I mean, look, you take what you can get. So you all are in a place where this kind of conversation could in fact happen, and you are beyond, let's say, the minimum wage. Here you've all agreed that the minimum wage is not sufficient. Now, to get to a living wage, or a family wage, or to recognize that gender plays a huge role in determining what kinds of options are available for folks, and we're not even going to talk about the child care thing. That's a whole nother lecture. But let it suffice to say that when Murray is writing, she is taking aim at, let's say, the narrative that begins with Moynihan and then is pushed forward by, for example, the Black Panthers. In that particular struggle, Black women were handicapped by the continuing stereotype of the Black matriarchy and the demand that Black women now step back and push Black men into positions of leadership. If Black men and women shared the indignities wrought by antebellum and postbellum indivisible nationhood, Murray reasoned, the rights of the entire group had to be recognized and protected as a matter of law. Murray thought Black women should not be made to feel disloyal to racial interests if they insisted upon women's rights. She refused to legitimize the zero-sum analysis of race and sex among Black people that often divided rather than unified efforts to achieve Black liberation. She implored Black women to strengthen the alliance between the Black Revolution and women's liberation because they had, quote, an equal stake in women's liberation and Black liberation. There is, however, yet another type of indivisibility suggested by Murray's essay. This indivisibility is linked to the way in which she frames one of the fundamental queries her essay is meant to address. And that question is, are Black women gaining or losing in the drive towards human rights? While her answer sounds in the language of equality and non-discrimination, she clearly sees these rights as requiring women's basic needs to be met. According to Murray, real equality and non-discrimination for Black women required, at the very least, adequate income maintenance and the elimination of poverty, repeal or reform of abortion laws, a national system of child care centers, extension of labor standards to workers now excluded, including domestic workers, cash maternity benefits as part of a system of social insurance, and the removal of all sex barriers to education and employment opportunities at all levels. Let me underscore, she's writing this in 1970. In this context, indivisibility describes how rights are interrelated and counters the idea of rights as organized in a hierarchy where first-generation civil and political rights are privileged over second-generation economic, social, and cultural rights. By focusing on the humanity of economically vulnerable and poor Black women, Murray's analysis appears to embrace a view of rights that resonates with this human rights vision and indivisibility. So now we turn from Paulie Murray to Moral Mondays. How many of you all have heard, at the very least, about Moral Mondays? 1, 2. 1, 2. Okay. No problem, I gotcha. Okay. Moral Mondays have, for at least a year, been happening in Raleigh, North Carolina. Why Raleigh, North Carolina? Because Raleigh is the state capital of North Carolina. Every Monday, groups of folks who are dissatisfied with what's going on in the government show up at the Capitol and they're arrested. Every single Monday. Now you might ask, what are they so mad about that they're getting arrested? Well, let's see. North Carolina Republicans, and I'm not saying it's a partisan thing, maybe it's just a coincidence rather than there being a matter of causation or correlation. Okay. So, you have a Republican majority in the North Carolina legislature as of 2010, and then they take the governor's mansion in 2012. So, it's a unitary government, as it were. Since then, the earned income tax credit has been eliminated for 90,000 North Carolinians. Medicaid coverage, the Medicaid expansion, which would have expanded Medicaid for 500,000 North Carolinians, that's been refused. They ended federal unemployment benefits for 170,000. They cut pre-K for 30,000 kids while shifting $90 million from public education to voucher schools. Slashed taxes for the top 5% while raising taxes on the bottom 95%. Axed public financing of judicial races, prohibited death row inmates from challenging racially discriminatory verdicts, passed one of the country's most draconian anti-choice laws, engaged in, enacted the country's worst voter suppression law, which mandates strict voter ID, cuts early voting, and eliminates same-day registration. And same-sex marriage equality was defeated, not soundly. I mean, it was close, but was defeated by vote in North Carolina. Okay, so what has happened is all of those things impacting all sorts of different people, all of those people realize we've got something in common. And this commonality is going to be the basis for us to, in fact, organize in a way that we're not accustomed to. We're stepping out of our silos, we're stepping out of our comfort zone. So while I may normally do voting rights work, I'm gonna get with the folks who normally do, let's say, reproductive choice work, because we recognize that we have way more in common than what might in fact separate us. But more importantly, if we combine our forces, our voices will in fact be amplified, and it will increase the likelihood that we'll be able to actually push in an effective way to, basically they want their government back. And it ends up starting in North Carolina because North Carolina ends up being incredibly important because below the Mason-Dixon line, North Carolina is probably one of the most progressive states that you would in fact encounter. And you have to consider, all right, I spent some time in New Jersey, but I also spent some time in Georgia. So it's not like I'm slinging someplace where I've never lived. So I say that to say, North Carolina is a lot different from Alabama or Louisiana or Mississippi. Even though most Northerners would conclude that if it falls below the Mason-Dixon line, it's all crazy and regressive. Including, most people don't realize Maryland is below the Mason-Dixon line, which I find to be absolutely fascinating, but that's a different conversation. Okay, so what they've done is they have built a multi-racial, multi-issue movement that is consciously and intentionally defined and centered around social justice. Some contend that the South hasn't seen this kind of movement since the 1960s. Now, you might say, well, that's North Carolina, that's one state. Well, guess what? There are Moral Mondays, although I think it was a Tuesday, but Moral Mondays in Georgia. The last straw was the refusal to accept the terms from the federal government for the expansion of Medicaid. And South Carolina, interestingly enough. So it is the beginning of a movement, a real movement, not a constructed movement, not a inside the Beltway, let's throw a lot of money through K Street lobbying efforts movement, but in the streets, we're knocking on people's doors, we're showing up, we're putting our bodies on the line kind of movement. And it is intergenerational, it's intersexuality, it's everybody under one great big umbrella saying, enough is enough. And we will lend our bodies to support your stuff, and you will lend your bodies to support our stuff, because what we see is that what we want is in fact about human rights. It goes back to this indivisible notion of it's not my issue, your issue. Our issues are about recognizing our what? Common humanity. We are both facing oppression in a way that requires us to figure out a different way to do business. So, as some might contend that, I wouldn't contend we're post-race, which is another conversation. I would contend that, identity politics have sort of run amok. And in some ways, what was intended to be a way to, in fact, permit us to connect has perhaps contributed to further alienation as an unintended consequence. I see what's happening in North Carolina and Georgia and South Carolina as evidence of this idea that enough is enough. And the only way we're going to change things is if we all come together and change things. There's another place, although it's not Moral Mondays, in Jackson, Mississippi. And I don't know how many of you all pay attention to what happens in Jackson, Mississippi, but in Jackson, Mississippi, there was a mayor who recently passed unexpectedly, Chokwe Lumumba. Chokwe Lumumba, the idea that Chokwe Lumumba could become the mayor of Jackson, Mississippi all by itself was extraordinary, because he was a founder of the Republic of New Africa, went to Mississippi from Detroit intending to change things, and eventually became the mayor. But there's going to be a conference in, I think it's June, looking at co-ops and the strength of cooperatives as a way to deliver services to individuals, to help organize individuals. The only reason that was possible was because Chokwe was able to become the mayor of Jackson, which required him to, in fact, have others in Jackson recognize that they had common humanity. And if it can happen in a place like Jackson, Mississippi, then one's to contend that it could almost happen anywhere. So, what do the Moral Mondays people want? And this is what I want to leave you with, because perhaps you'll have your own Moral Mondays, although in Maryland it would be slightly different. And I would never want to encourage you to somehow raise your voices to be heard by my former colleague, your county executive, Isaiah Leggett. But this is what Moral Mondays want. They want secure pro-labor, anti-poverty policies that ensure economic sustainability. They want to provide or have provided well-funded, quality public education for all. They are standing up for the health of every North Carolinian by promoting healthcare access and environmental justice across all state communities. They're addressing the continuing inequalities in the criminal justice system and ensuring equality under law for every person, regardless of race, class, creed, documentation, or sexual preference. And they're protecting and expanding voting rights for people of color, women, immigrants, the elderly, and students to safeguard fair democratic representation. There's not an objective or a demand there that anybody in this room can't get behind. So the hope is that by raising it with you, that perhaps you will find just a nugget of inspiration there, and to understand that I am often quite cynical, because at this date and age, I've seen movements, okay? I was a little young for some of them, but anti-apartheid movement, Southern Africa Solidarity movement. I have founded more organizations with people intending to do something transformative in a progressive way than I care to count. I was a little weary of it. I have to say, even in my weariness, I see a spark of something incredibly exciting happening in North Carolina. And my hope is that as more people pay attention to what's going on in North Carolina, we'll understand the unlimited potential and possibilities of what we can do when we stop to consciously embrace and work within a context that is based on the notion that we share a common humanity, and we all have rights to which we are entitled for no other reason than we are human beings. That's it. That's what human rights is about. And whatever it is that it takes to improve the material conditions under which people live, as long as that is measured not from the top, but is measured in terms of the least of us, it seems as if, at the very least, we're conscious in a way that allows us to understand that, as cynical as I might be, we cannot afford to, in fact, give up. There's hope there on the horizon. And I'm usually not very Pollyanna-ish. I'm kind of a realist. But there's hope there on the horizon. And the hope is that, I don't know, through your classwork, through your, is it one book, one text? One book project, through your conversations, I hope that perhaps I've sparked something for you to talk about. And if you can talk about it, then you can organize around it. If you can organize around it, then you can realize some real results. And if you can realize some real results, it means that you've done your part to make this a much better place, not only for you to live in, but for those who come behind you. If that's not the point of it all, then I guess we can all, pack up, go someplace and make a whole lot of money. But I have to say, having been on that side of it as a lawyer trained in the 80s and the 90s, that's unfulfilling as well. There's only so much spending you can do. Particularly when, in order for you to spend, you've got to step over people who don't have a place to live, right? You don't strike me as being that cold. Some of you are here because you have to be, because it's a class requirement. I get that. But I'm assuming that there are others in here who are here because it's something that you're interested in. And if you would you've given me graciously a nice little chunk of your time this evening. My hope is that it wasn't a waste of your time and that you found something, at the very least, provocative in what I've had to share with you tonight. So, thank you.
My question specifically about crimes against humanity, specifically war crimes committed by our domestic leaders. And I kind of realize as a nation we usually focus on crimes against humanity abroad, specifically when they're committed by foreign leaders who don't have the same economic interests as us and similar conditions. But what does it say about our common humanity when we don't require domestic leaders like Dick Cheney and Donald Rumsfeld to answer to the World Court on human rights abuses like torture and things like that?
Thanks for the question. It says a lot about our, in some ways, the lack of common humanity, but it's a particularly American thing. There's a notion, it's termed American exceptionalism. And the idea is it's very parental. Do as I say, not as I do. I get to set the terms, I get to tell you what you have to do, but you can't possibly turn around and do it to us, or do it to me. This is, in fact, manifested most, I think most starkly in the fact that the United States has played a role in negotiating the terms of every major international human rights instrument that's been written. We have, in fact, signed and ratified a handful of them, in large part because is the ones that we don't ratify, we don't think that they apply to us. Even the ones we ratify them under conditions. They're called, technically, reservations, understandings, and declarations. We ratify them in a way that sets our Constitution as the highest level that we promise to, in fact, abide by. Which means that, for example, under the Convention for the Elimination of Racial Discrimination is defined as intentional, so things that are erased on their face, like the old Jim Crow laws, but also neutral laws that are neutral on their face that have a racially discriminatory impact. So, the prison industrial complex. Michelle Alexander's book about mass incarceration, the new Jim Crow, that would, under international standards, give rise to a violation on the part of the United States. But because of the way that we've ratified the treaty, we've basically said that the more expansive definition of racial discrimination doesn't apply domestically. Now, hopeful? I am hopeful, because part of what part of what's happened, let's say, in the past, what is this? This is 2014, 15 or so years, more engagement by civil society, particularly in the United States, with traditional civil rights organizations and civil liberties organizations, one, beginning to do human rights work. So now the ACLU has a human rights program, and it's not a human rights program that's looking outward, it's a human rights program that's looking right here. Who else? The NAACP has a human rights division now that does specific human rights work, not as a matter of gazing outward, but as a matter of, okay, what do human rights look like when they come this way? Only if we, in fact, educate people, I believe, so that we hold our government accountable in a way that demonstrates we understand what our obligations are as members of the international community, will that change. But in a country where most people aren't even educated with respect to the basic requirements of our own Constitution, hence the notion that, I don't know, somehow the president or the Senate was supposed to come up with a budget, right? All you have to do is read the Constitution and realize that no, those bills have to originate in the House as a matter of constitutional requirement. But the vast majority of the people in the United States aren't even acquainted with our own Constitution, let alone recognize that under the Supremacy Clause of the Constitution, the supreme law of the land is what? The Constitution, the laws made thereunder, treaties signed and ratified. So they started to sign and ratify treaties, and the more that happens, the more that those who are inclined to do so have the ability to try to hold the United States accountable. Hold the United States accountable not just in the United States, but I've gone with folks to Geneva and sat there while the United States told the official story about, oh, I don't know, school to prison pipeline. School discipline is the way that it is because black and brown children are more unruly rather than it's racialized. As we sort of stand here today, I want to say it was either today or yesterday, the Inter-American Commission on Human Rights had a hearing on stand your ground laws. So you're beginning to see activists in the United States basically put the United States on blast outside of the US and then use that as pressure to, in fact, hopefully get some change domestically. But I think that that's what it's going to take, more informed individuals to say, look, we've got war criminals. But it's part of the reason why, who is it? I think it's Cheney who won't go to Spain because of universal jurisdiction, and Spanish jurists have said, there's at least one who said, yeah, you all come on, because if you come, we're going to arrest you, and then we will be able to perhaps hold you to account for the war crimes and crimes against humanity that you have, in fact, permitted to occur.
Thank you very much.
You're welcome.
Thank you, Professor, for coming tonight. I have a question concerning the, do you think we are winning on the war on terrorism?
No, but like the war on poverty and the war on drugs, it's not a war we're intended to win.
Okay.
Right? The notion of war generally, historically, has required at the very least identifiable sides where there is an actual nation state or country involved.
Okay.
The war on terror or terrorism doesn't sort of follow that particular model. I don't even know that it was necessarily designed to, in fact, be won. I think that what it does is it instills fear and encourages extreme xenophobia and violence against individuals perceived to be of a particular origin. And it gives the federal government basically carte blanche to do just about whatever it wants to do as long as it can contend that what it's pursuing is in the interest of national security. But winning, Yeah, I don't think that it was ever anything anyone intended to win. So no.
Do you think injustice create terrorism?
Absolutely. Injustice, inequality,
Okay.
the denial of the basic humanity of individuals,
Okay.
the elevation of profit over people. Sure. And it's a good thing, it's a lot of people who have died lately, which is really unfortunate. It brings to mind another person who recently died, Amiri Baraka,
Okay.
former poet laureate of the state of New Jersey. The reason why he was, well, they couldn't actually remove him, so they just abolished the position. But it was because he wrote a poem that raised these kinds of issues. That is, did what happened on September 11th, was that the result of things that we had actually done? In terms of abandoning people in particular areas of the world where we had meddled, we had created circumstances, and we pulled out because we thought that we had achieved our objectives. Charlie Wilson's War, right? The movie, in terms of, you take it to a certain point, and he's saying, okay, now what we need to do is we need to pay attention to building infrastructure, we need to build schools, we need to do all the rest of these things, but the military powers that be had gone to a different place. And by that time, they didn't address the underlying or root causes of whatever the conflict was in that particular country. So if you don't ever address the underlying or root causes, if you don't address the inequality, the poverty, the extreme vulnerability and disadvantage, then after a while, you basically sow what it is that you reap. I'm not having a chickens coming home to roost moment, but in some ways it is. So if we're going to lead and lead by example, it requires that we begin by recognizing that it comes back to that common humanity piece. But if we can't, in fact, practice it within our own borders, what hope is there in terms of the government's position? What hope is there to be able to, in fact, practice it with respect to people who aren't viewed as being part of us? I mean, if we can't even do it with our family, as it were, what can be expected when you're dealing with folks who are outside of your family? So until we tend to our own home, as it were, I fear that it is absolutely an unwinnable situation.
Thank you very much.
You're welcome.